My name is Susan Douglas. I'm the chair of the Department of Communication Studies, and I want to welcome you to this talk and say how happy we all are that you're here. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Fara Warner. Fara was our visiting Marsh professor last year, and she was so enormously popular with our students and did such an outstanding job of teaching that we had no choice but to ask her to come back for a second year. She has taught a variety of courses for our students, including one on the blogosphere, which she may talk about in her remarks today. Fara worked for years for the Wall Street Journal. She's also worked as a freelance journalist. Her areas of interest and specialization have in particular been international news and international business news. She's also been very interested in the role that the news media and the press play in identifying and promoting trends. Most recently, she, like many of us, have been very interested in and concerned about what's going to happen to newspapers. And for those of us who can't imagine getting up in the morning without, the paper, with our morning coffee, and was wondering when a new business model is going to emerge, and also seeing the role that the blogs and blogosphere is playing in utterly reconfiguring the news media, Fara's work is really at the center of these concerns and at the center of these debates. So please join me in welcoming our fabulous Marsh professor, Fara Warner, who will talk about the blogosphere and the future of journalism.
Thank you, Susan. I'm so happy to see so many of my students in the room and so many friends and all of my Knight Wallace colleagues and fellows. I'm really happy to see you here. So I am going to talk about the blogosphere, the future of journalism. Basically, that is the title of a course that I teach here at the University of Michigan, and I'm going to show you some of my students' work. I'm going to talk about business models. But I wanted to say first, a day doesn't seem to go by anymore that we don't hear about something happening in the news media. Today I was driving over here, and on the Diane Rehm show, Leonard Downey of Newsweek was on, Alan Mutter of the San Francisco Chronicle was on, all talking about sort of what is happening to the news media. We have hit sort of the perfect storm. It isn't just the internet that is having an effect on media. It is the economy having a huge effect on the business models of news media, and particularly the effect on newspapers. Our business model for newspapers has been built around this idea, is that people, like advertisers, wanted to get to you. And so they bought advertising in newspapers. Well, guess what? Who buys advertising in newspapers? Retail stores like Macy's, car dealerships, realtors, classified ads, all four of which have been hurt tremendously by this economy. So I'm going to talk about that, but I'm also going to talk about the future, because I've spent a lot of time over the past several weeks actually listening to people talk about my industry, and I'm tired of the woe is me, stick our heads in the sand, and that newspapers are going to go extinct. Journalism is not dead. It is vibrant, and it is active, and is being pursued around the world, and I'm going to talk about that as well. But just a little bit of the state of the union right now. 13,000 journalists lost their jobs last year in the United States. Newspapers, large and small, are going out of business. The most notable of late, obviously, was the Rocky Mountain News, which seemed to sort of create in people this sort of panic. People hit the panic button when they heard the Rocky Mountain News. This is a paper that when I was going to Columbia University was one of the papers that you absolutely wanted to get an internship with or you wanted to work with. A paper in Boulder, Colorado. Why would I want to work there? Why wouldn't I want to work at the New York Times? But it at one time was a very powerful regional newspaper. But this has been happening for a long time. My students in one of my classes just read a book by David Mindich called Tuned Out, and it talks about how this generation has been tuning out of the news. They're not interested in the news. Well, I have news to tell you. They were talking about that with my generation as well. I went to the University of Utah, and the year that I was graduating, we voted in the candidates of a party that was called the Who Cares Party. Because basically, that's what people thought of us, is that we didn't care. Well, guess what? We cared. And 20 years on, we're still having this issue of people tuning out. There are reasons for why I think that's true, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. To me, radio in particular, talk radio and cable television is not about news. It is about talking heads and partisan politics. It is about argument, it is about debate, it is about fighting words. It's not really about giving people the news. It's a cheap way to have entertainment. You get Rush Limbaugh on a stage, or you get Bill Maher on a stage. I found out earlier this week that Ann Coulter and Bill Maher have been doing concerts, basically. So that's entertainment. That's not news. Local television is also having the same problems as newspapers. Local television, if you turn it on, gives us the weather, traffic, and sports, and maybe, if we're very lucky, a little bit of news. Guess what? I can get a widget on my Macintosh computer that gives me traffic, sports, and weather. I don't need to tune in to local television to hear what they're saying. National network morning shows. I do my best to watch these people every morning because I figure I need to be watching the news. But if they continue to cover the antics of sports stars and celebrities and leave me gasping for information about the war, about the economy, and the important news, then what really do we have in journalism today? What really are we losing to the blogosphere? Young people tell me, my students in the class tell me, that they get their news from Jon Stewart over Charlie Gibson, if they actually know who Charlie Gibson is. And you know why they tell me? And pardon my language, because they say he tells you what's bullshit and what's not. Which is intriguing to me, because we are supposed to be dispassionate observers of the news. We are not supposed to tell you what's bullshit or not. We're supposed to listen to everybody's bullshit and report it to you. News websites, but since that, so that's sort of the state of the union of traditional journalism, I would say. But since 1998, when LiveJournal went up, tens of millions of blogs have been launched. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them are great. News sites, which are often built off of blogging website applications like the Voice of San Diego and Scoop44.com, has started up to cover local and national news with very different business models and very different ways of thinking about reporting. And most importantly, I will go back to this point, very different business models for how they operate. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we look at what's happening to the state of news today. I keep saying they need to make bigger podiums, but aggregators like the Huffington Post and the Daily Beast, once only aggregators of news, are actually hiring their own correspondents to write the news. Talking Points Memo, which was once mostly a blogger website, is now hiring people to cover the news as well. We also have, in recent months, seen the Mumbai attacks last November covered by things that are really not traditional media forms, but gave us a sense of being in on the action even before the news got there. It was covered by tweets and by cell phone videos before CNN showed up. Now I know, and I've heard the arguments, that some of those tweets were wrong. Some of them were false. Some of them were actually put out consciously to be wrong, and were not factual. But guess what? I've seen the Associated Press put out headlines that are wrong too, and have to retract those. And I know that journalism has its pretenders who consciously write false stories. That is the truth of journalism. It's also the truth that many of us do our jobs as best as we can. We search for accuracy, and we search to be honest, truthful purveyors of the news. But that's not always the case that happens. And so to look at traditional media and say, there's this holy grail and we do it the best and you, Mr. Blogger, can't do it, is woefully unfair. We've also seen the Christian Science Monitor go completely online, and we'll see more of this, I think, as the years progress. But at the same time, Politico.com has actually started printing its news in Washington, D.C. 3 times a week. CNN's website streamed the inaugural address to 26 million users over the internet, but it also streamed that video to people on their cell phones. And don't even get me started about where we're going in terms of mobile technology, because this is actually dead for most people as well. Looking at the internet online on a computer screen, if you live in China, you get your news and you get your internet service through your mobile phone. You don't go home and log on. You get everything through your mobile device. So we come to this point. A recent survey by the Pew Research Center on the People and Press revealed very recently that Americans, and not just young Americans, would rather get their news online than from newspapers. That is especially true for young people. So what does this say about the future of journalism? I think some people would say, well, newspapers are going extinct. Oh, woe is me. I would say that journalism is a living, breathing, and vibrant thing that is happening. It is still a living, vibrant industry in this country. It just is taking different forms. And I think if we don't see that it's going through revolution and evolution all at the same time, that we will lose journalism in this country if we continue to stick our heads in the sand. For me, it is a very trying and scary time to be a journalist. Even as I teach, I continue to write, and I continue to do my craft. But I also think it is one of the best times in journalism, because it is making me think about my job much more than I ever thought about it in the past. And it is definitely one of the best times to be teaching communications. A few weeks ago, I was very lucky to attend a Poynter Institute for a 4-day conference on multimedia journalism, and I'm going to let you listen in to something that I did as a sort of test of what my possibility was to become a multimedia journalist. If I can get my mouse back. So I'm going to have you take a look at this, but I'd like you to read, and I will read for you. Potter Stewart said, "Much speech that seems to be of little or no value will enter the marketplace of ideas, threatening the quality of our social discourse and more generally the serenity of our lives. But that is the price to be paid for constitutional freedom." Just because the serenity of our lives is being upset right now doesn't mean that it shouldn't be upset. Whoa. As you can tell, I'm not used to using a PC. Hello? There it is. So this is a website that I set up. If you haven't seen Tumblr, you might want to take a look at it. It's a blog posting site that Yahoo is probably about to buy for about 8 figures. I always tell my students, I think one day I'm either going to be working for one of you, or you're going to create the technology that actually changes the world of journalism. So I'll let you listen in to what multimedia educators are talking about in terms of the future of journalism. Maybe. This is what happens when you use technology.
Just under the pause, go back.
Oh, sorry.
Click on it. See if you get the pause button.
Oh. Now it's not happy. Sorry. There we go.
Yeah, just hit that till it goes near here.
Let's try this one. Make no. So this is the problem with streaming video on an internet connection that is flickering in and out. We'll come back to this. So, what you would hear from them, and there we go. What you would hear from these educators, I think, is really interesting. They're very introspective. They're very worried about what's happening in journalism. And yet underneath, I think that there is a great sense of optimism about what is driving my profession today. And I think what they see is sort of the power of their students in the classroom to be thinking about things. Some universities now have record enrollment for journalism courses. Why, at a time when newspapers are going extinct and television news is so bad, why do we have so many young people who want to get into the business of journalism, or they just want to learn the tools of journalism? And I think that we will survive, because for me, that is a hope. It is also an imperative, because I cannot see this profession die. I do believe in its power and its influence in a democracy, and that it must stand as the voice to the voiceless and a questioner of the establishment. Absolutely. But in my old age, because my 20-year-old students make me feel very old sometimes, I have come to understand that my world is about to change. And indeed, my world has already changed. In the past few months and weeks, I've listened to other people around campuses, from this campus to cable television stations, and I said, they bemoan the lost audiences, even though we've been losing audiences for more than 2 decades. Mindich points out in his book that people started tuning out in the 1960s. Not in the 1990s, not in the 21st century. Back in the 1960s, people were already starting to tune out and tune off of traditional journalism. And I told my students that they also bemoan the loss of objective journalism, even though many people outside and inside this profession would call journalism, particularly as we know it today, to be anything but objective. And they talk about bloggers and citizen journalists with sneers that these people cannot do our jobs. The analogy that they give is, would you want an untrained person to do surgery on you? I'm not sure that I completely agree with the analogy between doctors and journalists. Yes, what sets me apart from bloggers and untrained citizens shooting video is an education and lots of work experience. But there's one major reason that we don't license journalists in this country, and we do not force them to run the gauntlet of skills tests and taking exams. Because for most of us, we learn on the job. And the reason that we don't do this is because the freedom of press and the freedom of speech is simply not for those of us who have a degree and who have done it for 20 years. Nor does it solely cover those people, like A.J. Liebling once said, that freedom of the press belongs to the person who can own a press. Well, guess what? Anybody can own a press now. You can take a computer, you can take blogging software, you can take a flip video camera phone, and you can become maybe a journalist. I'm not saying that the first thing that you put out is going to be journalism, but maybe the next thing and the next thing, and after about 10 or 15 years of blogging, you actually have set yourself up as being a trained journalist. I learned on the job. Yes, I went to Columbia Journalism School, but for the most part, I was thrown into this profession by editors who would say, go out on the street and find a story. Does that make me any different than the blogger today? The internet is not the bogeyman. And in fact, I think it might be the thing that saves journalism and raises it to a new level. But it will never do that if we continue to be resistant to change. I listened to friends of mine at the Wall Street Journal who were like, well, do I have to take a video camera with me? Do I have to do those kinds of things? Because, I just write words. No, you're a journalist. You don't just write words. You also capture video. You also listen to people's words. I am a print journalist. I'm an old print journalist. I grew up at the Wall Street Journal. I practiced my craft at Fast Company, Forbes, the New York Times. You name it, I've probably written that story. I wrote a book which was close to 100,000 words. But now I consider myself a multimedia journalist in training. And often my students are my teachers. At first, that scared me to death, that I actually had students who knew more than I do. Now it actually inspires me greatly to watch my students stand up in front of my classroom and give lectures on things that I don't know anything about, but they do. And that's pretty cool, that they're actually teaching me. If we'd been able to watch my little video there, I would have told you that I shot that video. I edited in Final Cut Pro, which was a big task for me because I'm scared of Final Cut Pro. I uploaded it on the web into Vimeo, which is a video website hosting, in all of about 5 hours. Is it the best? Is it perfect? Well, if you go on my Tumblr site, you can tell me. Is it journalism? I don't know. But the great thing about the internet is that you get to decide. And this morning when I went on the Vimeo site, somebody's following my videos. I have someone who's actually following me on Vimeo and wants to see more videos of mine, which is pretty interesting to me, that somebody just picked me sort of out of nowhere to say, I liked what you were doing. I like hearing people in their own voices. For me as an old print journalist, the idea that I have a person's face and their words is amazing to me. For people who are broadcast journalists, you've always had that. But I love the idea of putting both the text and the story and the audio and the video all together. And that is what the internet has given me. And for that, I am eternally grateful. I am a more capable, a more thoughtful, a more ethical journalist today than I was a year ago. Because I have to think about, am I going to run music underneath a multimedia piece of journalism? Is that, don't throw your papers like that. Is that an ethical issue that I have to think about? A student the other day asked me, what do you think about shooting in black? What do you think about turning a video into black and white? And I said, well, does it make an editorial comment? What does it say if you've taken color video and turned it into black and white video? Is that fair? Is that an editorial comment? And I have to think about those things that I've never thought about before. And I say this because not that I'm special, but I think that we have to be willing to learn, to grow, and to explore. Because if we don't, then we do face a future without journalism. Because if there's nothing else, I hope that journalists are people who think and grow and change, and who are willing to jump off of a cliff and try something new. For too long, I believe we've looked into the past for solutions instead of facing the future and exploring what are the new ways of practicing and paying for journalism. By doing this, I think we've left a very big vacuum out there that has left the door wide open for this blogosphere, for this world that we look at that is full of rants and raves, its lacks ethics, and its lack of focus on really good business models. This is the blogosphere everybody talks about, that people are not writing truthful and ethical things about people. We left this door open because when we first started looking at the internet for journalists back in the early 2000s, it hasn't actually been that long. Google's only been around for 11 years. Blogging only started in the early 2000s. So this hasn't happened to us over 20 or 30 years. It's happened to us in about 10 years. But we left that door open for other people to step in. Because you know what was happening? You had companies like the New York Times company that decided to start New York Times Digital, and they were going to do a big IPO of NY Times Digital and make a lot of money. So they had 2 separate newsrooms, 2 separate advertising staffs, and while they were doing that, the world went on. Well, guess what? Convergence happened, and it had to happen, because there's no way that you can support 2 newsrooms, 2 advertising staffs, and yet that's what people have done. It reminds me far too much of the car companies that I have covered and still continue to cover. These are businesses that did not see the future, that were scared of competition, that were worried too much about holding on to old business models, that they didn't see something new coming down. Or even worse, and I see this with newspapers, unfortunately, they rode a business model into the ground, and they didn't have anything to follow on from that. And I think that's what's happening in the newspaper business. What's happened, as I said, a very poor economy that is slipping, as people are now calling it, I like the Great Recession. Why don't we just call it what it is? And a shifting media landscape maybe brought our comeuppance in journalism a few months early or a few years early. But like other industries, we were not leaders in this, but followers in the world of multimedia journalism. Instead of leading, we are playing catch-up. Catch-up with people like the Harvard students who created Scoop 44. We'll try this again. Scoop 44 is a website. Has anybody ever seen Scoop 44? Do you know what Scoop is? I'm going to use a Sarah Palin term, a shout out to Aswin, because he's tweeting this lecture right now, which I'm very impressed with. Aswin is a professor in comm studies. This was started by Harvard students, Harvard and Princeton students, and basically it is young people writing about politics and writing about the Obama administration in the way that they want to see it covered, because this is the guy that they helped elect. And they actually are holding his feet to the fire. Is it perfect journalism? Do they do everything right all the time? Probably not. But you know what? None of us do it right all the time. So you have these funny little videos. I'm not even going to try video. That's too scary right now. But he does these videos where and it's not perfect film. The audio is bad. But it's an idea. It's something that these students said, we're going to cover the Obama administration the way we want to cover it. Not the way the Times is going to cover it, not the way CNN, not the way anybody else out there is, but the way we see our world. So you might want to take a look at Scoop 44. As Tom Curley said in 2007, our focus must be on becoming the very best at filling people's news needs. That's a huge shift from the world we know best, which is gatekeeper thinking. Gatekeeper thinking. As journalists, we're supposed to be storming the walls of gatekeepers, right? We're supposed to be trying to tear these things down, and yet we set ourselves up as the gatekeepers. As he said, readers and viewers are demanding to captain their own information ships, and we should let them. Yes, it comes with risk and consequences, and it's scary, but it also comes with great promise, I think. We also have other places that you can look at, and this is what is very interesting to me, is that we always look at journalism and say, what are we losing with all these bloggers, with all these people? Well, guess what? I worked at the Wall Street Journal, where the Bancroft family held sway, the Sulzbergers at the New York Times. Is this the kind of journalism that I really wanted to practice? Because I love what Bob McChesney says. The founders never held the view that if rich guys can't make money off of journalism, then we won't have journalism. Just because Sam Zell made a bad business deal, the Tribune companies are going out of business. Chicago Tribune still does very valuable, very honest, very important journalism. But because Sam Zell can't meet his payments on all the debt that he took on to buy that company, and Sam Zell's not even a journalist. He's a real estate magnate. So you have organizations like Voice of San Diego, which is a website that was started by the community as well as journalists who had decided that the folks at the San Diego newspapers weren't doing what they wanted to do for them. The interesting thing about the Voice of San Diego, and they make a big point of telling you this a lot online, is that over the past 4 years, they have raised $2.7 million from citizens and foundations. They proudly state on the website that they spend 10% of their budget on distributing the news. 10%. Many newspapers spend up to 70% of their budget on distribution. Ink, paper, the guys that have to drive around and deliver the newspapers, they don't spend that money on content. Most of the Voice of San Diego budget goes to coverage, to the journalist, to the story, to the content. And the Voice has inspired other web startups. This is a big concern for me, and I think we have to figure out business models, because I don't want to lose journalism as one of those jobs where you can have a nice middle-class life doing what I'm doing. I do want to be able to pay my mortgage and pay my bills doing journalism. And so I need to find a way to create a business model that will allow me to do that. And I think that is where we really need to start talking a lot about. The next one I wanted to show you is spot.us, which is yet another interesting website. This is a website that does crowdfunding. So the idea behind Spot is that you donate money to a story. So this is a story pitch that was put up on Spot.us. It basically is out of San Francisco mostly. The pitch is Tale of Two Censuses tracks, San Francisco, rich and poor. This was posted back in December. So people can go in and donate $25 to this story to be done. There's a price that is set for how much the story will cost to be done, and then they put it out to a freelancer and say, here's $5,000, please go out and do this piece of journalism. No one person can contribute more than 25% of that total. And part of that, a pretty significant percentage, between 10 and 25% of that fee, actually goes to a fact checker, who then goes behind the journalist and checks the information. And so crowdfunding is a really interesting model that may work. I'm a business journalist, a business freelance journalist. If someone told me that every month there was a place where I could go and there was a great story, and it was $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 a month, if it's a great story, I'll go do it. And I'd be happy to have the community paying for that and not an advertiser, not a car dealer, not a realtor, but real people who want the news that they want. So that's spot.us. So I think, again, we just have to keep looking at different models. But I also think we have to look at the future. And I think we have to look at what what's happening on our college campuses. And just because I like my students so much in 439, I wanted to give you a little taste of what kids on this campus are doing. So the first one, and I hope this works because you should all get to hear this. So Palestra.net is a college website that takes, oh, that's an interesting ad. Yeah, do we want to vote now? Just like, there was a Facebook site, a Facebook group that went up that was like, save a newspaper, buy a newspaper. And I wanted to come up with a counter Facebook group that was like, click on an ad on a news website, save journalism. Because we have to go online and start viewing advertising. But let me see if I can get Caitlin's work to come up. Since I know we all like the Michigan rivalry with OSU, we'll see if this will work. I checked all of these too. It was working perfectly earlier today, I promise you. So while this thinks for a few minutes, Caitlin is not here tonight. She's actually covering the basketball championships, the Big Ten. Caitlin Urka is a self-taught multimedia journalist. A number of my students know her as the general manager of WOLV, which is the campus television station. She runs roughshod over them, trying to teach them multimedia journalism. She has done an amazing job of overhauling the WOLV website, getting streaming video up on the websites. So I wanted to give you a piece of that. I keep losing my cursor. And then I wanted to bring up this. So this is a website. So I teach a course in multimedia journalism, and this is a website that was created last semester by a group of students that wanted to take a look at music life around campus. And it wasn't just about music, it was also about news. And they wrote any number of stories. They used a website called Wix.com, which is a lot like a PowerPoint. It's pretty easy to load and get work up on. They're always required to create a code of ethics and show it directly on their site, because I do think that a lot of the blogosphere is not held to certain ethical standards. But whenever I ask a person who's coming in from a traditional news website, I ask them where their code of ethics is, they can't tell me. So the Detroit Free Press, I can't find their code of ethics. I don't find one on CNN. I don't know where it exists. So how do I know what the ethics of those journalistic places are? But for my students in my class, I require them to have a code of ethics. And I'm not going to play this video, but it's a great video about a band on campus called The Great Divide. And what's really cool about this story is that it's not just a story about a band. It's about kids who have decided that this is the work that they want to do. And they're full-time students, all of them, who play in this band. And yet they're able to sort of get out there, this is what they want to do with their lives. And it's a great look at what is happening on the University of Michigan campus. And I've always said that if I took all of the journalism that is represented on these news websites, I would come away with an amazing website about what's happening on campus. So I think that's a little bit of what my students can do. But I also want to talk about what else can happen on the internet. Because I do think that if we as educators and communicators can get people to tune in, there is such a vast wealth of information on this box. I don't know if any of you are aware, but yesterday, March 10th, was the 50th anniversary of the Dalai Lama fleeing from Tibet. And it has caused a huge martial law. Well, if you listen to the New York Times, martial law has been imposed in China. If you read blogs from Tibet, you'll read about that. But you can also go to the ChinaDaily.com website and get their version of the news. 50 years ago, I couldn't do that. I would listen to what Walter Cronkite told me about what was happening in Tibet. Now, I can go to TibetBlogs.com and I can find out what people there are talking about. Not what I think about the situation, not what some other person thinks about it, but what they think about their situation. I'm a Mac person, I have to say. So this is Tibet blogs, which will come up in just a minute. But this, to me, is the power of what can happen, of what can happen on the internet. I get to listen to what people are talking about in Tibet. I also get to see what the Chinese government is telling me. And between those two, as well as listening to the New York Times and what's happening on CNN, and anybody else that I can get my hands on, maybe I actually will come up with the truth of the situation as the way I see it, not as just one single person sees it. Just gonna shut that down, okay. I'm happy to send slides to people as well so you can see this. 4 weeks ago, when I was at the Poynter Institute, I had a chance to meet Robert Deng, who came from Fudan University, all the way from China, to take part in the Poynter Institute's multimedia journalism event that I was at. And this is a man who lives and works in a country that doesn't have press freedom. And yet there are 400 journalism schools in China. So if he can be excited about journalism and what it can do, then why can't we? Why can't we be the ones who take the lead in changing journalism, maybe forever? I think it is, as educators, and I see this, as our responsibility to inspire our students so that they're interested in the world, so they can take advantage of everything that is in this internet. Because if we don't do that, who's going to do that? And one of the big questions about tuning out is that have we forgotten to teach people it's relevant and it's important to know what's going on in the rest of the world. And now we can know what's going on from the rest of the world. So as I end, and I want to take questions and comments, I saw this quote a couple of days ago and I thought it was perfect. To invent, you need a good imagination and a pile of junk. I think we have a lot of imagination. And journalism right now, in some instances, looks like a pile of junk. So what do? So what is our junk to create the 21st century journalism? And these are just some of the ideas that I have to address some of the problems that I think do exist. I think we need new business models. We need more ideas like crowdfunding. We need ideas like micropayments. Is it possible to have an iTunes for journalism? Would you pay 99 cents to read the New York Times every day? What would you pay to get that kind of information? What can we do with social networks such as Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook to actually tune people back into the news? Is that possible? What could we do with those tools? Because right now, we use those tools very personally, but I think they have larger applications. There are tools like Cover It Live and Mogulus, which are live video capture tools that actually make news gathering, video gathering, far less expensive. No longer do I have to send a satellite truck to a news event. As long as I have a computer and it has a camera in it and I have a wireless connection, I can cover it live at coveritlive.com. Kite marks, which is a new area that people are talking about, and I know this is a big issue on the internet. Not everything you read on the internet is true. I know it's a crazy thought, but it's not. So the idea of kite marks is that there would be digital watermarks, so there would be metadata embedded in the website that may help us to begin to create multimedia journalism that lives up to the ideals that I was taught at Columbia University. These kite marks wouldn't be created by a regulatory body telling us what's truthful and factual information, but from the bottom up, sort of through an open source, factual, accurate way of saying enough people have said that this is factual information that you can trust it. And we need new search engines. We can no longer depend on Google to tell us what the news is and what is relevant to us. We probably need to have something like a choice engine that focuses on our preferences, accuracy, and relevance to us, not only on search words and page links that can easily be gamed and are being gamed. And so I also think you need to stay tuned in. So this is what was happening in the news today. Hopefully, oh look, it works when it's around the net. So this was if you're interested, Around the Net in Media is posted every day by Media Post News, and it's basically an aggregation tool. I know lots of people don't like aggregators, but they do bring you to the news. We just have to figure out how to get paid for aggregation. So right now, I don't know if you noticed on the New York Times website, the digital chief of New York Times Company has been taking reader questions. And he has actually said that newspaper competitors working together on a cooperative news outlet is a real possibility as the industry struggles. Why do PCs do that? And then good old Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch buys paper in Brooklyn. Rupert Murdoch is still buying newspapers. What is up with this guy? He knows something. He bought the 31-year-old independent newspaper, the Brooklyn paper, has been purchased by Rupert Murdoch. So I think what you also have to do is think about what's happening in journalism. Stay committed to it, both as citizens and as communicators. Because if you lose us, where's the voice going to come from? Who is going to stand up to those people? Who's going to stand up to the gatekeepers? Who is going to be the voice for the voiceless? And it's in all of us to be able to do that. Not just those people who have set themselves up to be journalists for the past 150 years. I think the game has changed. It's a scary game. It's a new way of doing things. But it is where it's at. And I think that we have to stop blaming other people for what's happening to our business and start looking at ourselves. As my students hear all the time, I say to them, if you had set out to create a technology that was perfect for journalism, it would look a lot like the internet. It has the immediacy of the AP, those headlines that go out. It has depth to house terabytes of data so that I can look at scholarly works or I can look at long-form written work that I still love. I still love getting the New Yorker. I still love getting the Atlantic and reading those. But it also has the ability to post audio and video and to send information around the world. If it does nothing other than that, the free flow of information around the world is a game changer. That I know what's happening in Tibet right now is pretty amazing because China has put it into lockdown, if I am to believe what's happening in Tibet right now. No doubt the blogosphere is going to bring with it problems and concerns. We can either address them and start moving forward, or we can let others do it for us. And I, for one, am not about ready to let somebody else do this for me. So I'd like to take questions, and I also wanted to, well, let me go back to this if I can. I have a few things. I have some people to thank. I wanted to thank the Marsh family for their support and to Com Studies for being such a good family for the past 2 years. My thanks to the Poynter Institute and most importantly to my students in 439. So thanks very much. I think we have a microphone floating around. Do we have the mic?
Behind you.
Oh, does any? If you want to ask questions, I think we can. If you have questions, I will repeat it. Oh, come on, there have to be questions. I know it's late and Chipotle has free burritos, but. Oh, Mr. Kiley and then Tony. Yeah.
Do you think that the problem that we're having with newspapers now is really traceable to the failure of the business sides of those companies to monetize where readers and consumers have been going? It seems to me that we're still hungry for information. It's the failure of the business people at those companies to figure out a way to continue to charge for what they do.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the business side, particularly in newspapers, it has been sort of asleep at the wheel in terms of how do we figure out how to get advertisers to pay for what people are doing online or viewing online. I mean, one of the big problems, obviously, is that it used to be that advertising content or advertising space was scarce. You had 3 television stations, you had a few newspapers in a certain market, and so you kind of had a monopoly. And it was pretty easy. A car dealer would call up and say, I want to place an ad. And I don't think that on the ad sales side, particularly in newspapers, that there has been enough of a shift and an understanding of what happens online and what we need to do. I mean, one of the things that people talk about is hyper-locality, hyper-local news, because so many local advertisers actually don't have any place to advertise anymore. Well, why aren't we out there trying to reach them? So I think it is a business side issue, but I don't want to let journalists off the hook as well. I don't think that we've been doing a very good job of using this medium in the way that we need to. And that is creating stickiness, of getting people to stay long enough on a website that an advertiser actually wants to be there. Because right now most people spend about 2 to 3 minutes on a news website, whereas the Wall Street Journal, the reason the Wall Street Journal can charge so much for their print edition ads is because people spend 30 minutes with that newspaper. It's a huge amount of time. So how do you juggle those two? Tony, do you have a question?
Yeah. Thank you. What do you think of the proposal to have 2 tiers, a free basic news service, and then you pay a certain amount of money to get premium content? I think Time Magazine is talking about it now, and the New York Times
Tried it.
So
the question was about 2-tiered content. Is there a way to give away some and then put other content behind a firewall? The Times tried to do this with, I forget what it was called. Time Select, thank you. And unfortunately, what happened is that they weren't getting as many Google searches, they weren't getting as many hits because people couldn't link to that. People weren't linking anymore. So you had to weigh a decision between, do you want aggregators to be able to pick up that information? Because Huffington Post will say that they are the 5th largest driver of readers to the New York Times. Do you really want to lose that? So I think, unfortunately, at least right now, and there may be a tipping point that happens where people are more comfortable paying for content on the internet. That may be coming. There's some people talking that people are starting to realize that just because free doesn't make it the best. But I think the genie is out of the bottle already on that. I think we've given it away for so long that we've got to figure out a different business model than 2 tiers. I'm not sure that it will work, in my personal opinion. Back.
One of my observations is that the work being done, whether on the traditional media websites or in the blog sites, is producing news faster and better than the traditional media. I'll use the Wall Street Journal as an example. I'm just curious your response to this. When I look at the Wall Street Journal blogs, which do not seem to be drawing an enormous number of eyes, if you judge by the comments there, contrasted to larger websites and blog sites. What I'm observing is that the Wall Street Journal blogs are producing stories that are not getting in the newspaper. And I'm assuming that it's these reporters, frustrated under the Wall Street Journal system, going and doing these stories. The point is that those stories are actually going to be the news, even if they're not the news now.
But they are the news, because they're up on, they are getting a voice now when they probably wouldn't have gotten a voice before without the
But if you
internet.
follow those stories, many of them are going to be on the front page in 1, 2, 6 months.
Yeah. Andrew Sullivan, who's a writer for the Atlantic Monthly, talks about blogging in a really interesting way. He actually calls it writing out loud. And he uses his blog as a way to sort of throw open ideas, to get ideas down onto a space where and it's much more free-flowing. And yes, he ends up using his blog as a way to then drive toward those larger stories. And I think you can get a lot of feedback from people. You can start to see these stories gain traction. So I think for journalists, one of the scary things is becoming overwhelmed with, you could work 24 hours a day as a journalist now. You could tweet You can blog, you can do your social network, you can write stories. I mean, when I worked at the Wall Street Journal, when we were moving to more multimedia, and it wasn't really multimedia at that time, if I was working on a story, I would write a piece for the wires. I would update it throughout the day. If it was an important story for international, I would rewrite it for the international editions. And then by about 7 o'clock, I would actually finally sit down and take a breath and say, well, now I have to write the piece for tomorrow's paper. Add to that having to blog, having to tweet, having to do all of those. My question is that a good way of doing journalism? I don't know. We're going to find out. Question?
Actually, I'm going to ask a question because I have the mic, and then I'll pass it on. There have been two competing explanations for the alleged decline of interest in the news and decline of circulation of newspapers, as well as the declining viewership of the network news. One is that Americans, aren't interested in the news. They're more interested in celebrity news and features and soft news. And so local television stations, newspapers have in fact sought to give the people allegedly what they want, but it still isn't enough, right? So that's one explanation. The other is that by doing that, newspapers and local television stations and even the networks have driven away the very audiences, readers, who actually want the meat and potatoes of the news and not, shark attacks and all the rest of it.
Right.
And so, I mean, these have been two very competing views of audiences and readership and also what the press has done. And I wonder how you sort those out and respond to those different kinds of explanations.
Well, it always intrigues me that when you ask, particularly television, but also newspaper, well, why do you run these stories? Ad nauseum, Paris Hilton, everything. Why do you run these? Well, this is what consumers want. But when you ask consumers, all they'll talk about is, well, why do they keep running these stories ad nauseum about Lacey Peterson or, my favorite, which is the Chicago cop who supposedly has now killed like 4 wives, Drew Peterson. He's constantly in the news, and it's like, but he's not news. I'm not interested in him. When was the last time I saw a really good piece on what's happening in Iraq? So I think somewhere along the lines, and I was having lunch today, and we were talking about this, somewhere there's a disconnect. Somebody's not telling the truth. Either consumers really do want this and they love it, or the media has chased after these. I think it's actually chasing after advertisers as opposed to chasing after readers. And the more that they can say, well, this draws consumers to us, like with sweeps weeks and things like that, is that really a good gauge of what consumers want? Is a ratings week a ratings sweep? I don't know. That is not meant to give you good. It's not meant to give you good content. A sweeps week isn't. It's meant to figure out how much we're going to pay, how much we're going to charge for our advertising content or our advertising space in a year. So it's not really about content. It's all about determining how much can I game the system so that you will pay an extra $100,000 a year for that 30-second spot. So I think, again, someone's not telling the truth, or the data isn't telling us what we need to know. So, there's a question back there. He's had his hand up.
One of the most recent sensible articles on monetizing the news that I've read was just in Business Week, and I know there's a Business Week reporter here. He may be able to tell you who wrote the story, but it was a fascinating article on monetizing. And I think when Fara, you talked about hyperlocal, when you look around and when you talk about the tiers in media, when you look at some of the privately owned newspapers, and I'm not talking about the corporate models, but the privately owned, that maybe are in 3rd and 4th generation of the same family, they're making money. Now they're down maybe 2%, but they're still at a respectable maybe 8%, whereas some of our larger media were at 20, 21%. There's not too many corporations that can show that kind of profitability. Now they drop down to about 9%. That doesn't pay off the debt that they have accrued from their purchases. And yet, when you say Rupert Murdoch is buying a paper in Brooklyn, all I can think of, well, yes, that's a neighborhood paper. That's a small market. That's a local market. And with local advertisers. But if any of you can see this Business Week article, plus there was a very good one, but a very long, ponderous, and dare I say academic article in, I believe it was the New Republic, and something about the corruption of news, but it was, it gave a wonderful historical overview.
So the guy patiently waiting on the side there.
If we look at browsers like Firefox, and especially, how they're gaining market share, Firefox has, 30%, that might be too big, I don't know. We also look at add-ons that Firefox supports, such as AdBlock, or something like that, which really block a lot of the content on these websites that they need for revenue. Are we going to have to look towards the generosity of the reader towards actually building money towards journalism? Because otherwise we'll have people that might pay for content on a site and then post it on their site for free, or the reader will just block the ads because they don't want something saying "click me for a free monkey," at the top of their browser. So how can we make money for blogs or journalism when people don't want ads on their screen and they're using tools to block that, and content can be free, pulled from professional sources?
Right. I think that you do see, particularly with Firefox, sort of the TiVo effect, which is how do we get around this? And there are, now that we've had TiVo around for long enough, there are actually advertisers who are starting to figure out how to put ads in so that you still see them. One of the things, if you look at YouTube, has an interesting model where you can actually agree to have ads embedded at the beginning of your YouTube videos that you put up, and so you would receive. So I don't know whether Firefox would block that. What I think Firefox probably blocks is pop-ups, much better than they even do now. Potentially banner, and potentially those ones where they do the wipes across the screen. Firefox probably gets rid of that. But if you look at some of the new models where you'll have, and I think a lot of what is happening online is also that we're going to a lot of video. A lot of people search YouTube for content, for video content, is that you'll have ads that kind of rise up during the middle of video and then drop down. You can click on it. I don't know whether Firefox has figured out a way to get rid of that, because the ad is actually embedded directly into the piece of content. And maybe that's what newspapers or people creating content online as text need to figure out a way so that blockers couldn't do something like that. But I do think, you look at crowdfunding is definitely one of the ways that people are talking about that communities have to start paying for their journalism instead of advertisers paying for that journalism. So, question?
Well, I certainly like the idea of getting rid of ads and using crowd payment and micropayment and that sort of thing, but do you think this creates a problem where there will be wealthy communities that have disposable income and can pay for their news and end up getting sort of a certain type of news, maybe a certain quality level of news, and then people who at least feel that they don't have the money to spend on that, they put up with the ad-supported news, which, maybe it's not a quality issue, but there's suddenly two different types of news. And before you didn't have that, before you had the New York Times reporter and a fair amount of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds would buy the New York Times and read the New York Times. So do you see that as a potential problem in the future if micropayments really take off? And if not, why not?
I think you already in some ways see that digital divide. The Wall Street Journal is the one newspaper, is the one news organization that can actually get money, get people to pay for an online subscription. So you've already created that kind of digital divide. If you're not willing to pony up $39.95 a year, but then the Journal was always for wealthy people. it was it's an expensive subscription. So I'm not sure that we haven't already had this existing already. I do fear that if we don't have a situation in which there is some kind of, and it might be a mixture, an aggregation of supported models that isn't just crowdfunding, but is also, there's a lot of discussion of foundations supporting news. I mean, one interesting thing is, although I don't think we want to follow Sarkozy in France, but for every 18-year-old in France is now getting a subscription to a newspaper bought for them by the French government. So I don't know if we're going to go that model or not yet, but that's one of the ways that Sarkozy is helping out the news media. But I think that we have to have more than one model, and I think that's been one of the problems for particularly newspapers, is that we've only had one business model. We haven't had a number of business models that could sort of catch all of those baskets. But I think it's a fascinating question as to what happens when you have to pay for content online. Who can afford it, and does the digital divide get even larger than it is already? Questions?
They used to say that pornographers drove a lot of the technology on the internet, and I think now it's Facebook and the whole terms of service fiasco that just happened in the last few weeks. And I just noticed how much more the New York Times is becoming a player on Facebook and their ability to target ads to different ages and different regions. Do you see them crossing back over in terms of some of what they're innovating with, crossing back over into internet journalism as we see it? With
You mean Facebook?
Yeah, just some of what they've been pioneering in terms of what people are willing to tell about themselves and get both ads and news targeted to them.
Well, I also think that Facebook offers a great opportunity for personal aggregation. I use Facebook in both of my classes, and I suggest to my students that they post interesting news on the Facebook group page, because what I want to see is if we can create a situation in which people are reading and they're interested in a story and they want to share it on Facebook. I think in the United States we see Facebook in one way. It's still very personal. But I have friends who live in Singapore, India, and China, and when I'm having conversations with them, it isn't about what I ate this morning. It's about Hindu-Muslim relations in India, which starts out first as a conversation about Slumdog Millionaire, but quickly turns into a very deep conversation about what's happening. And it all starts because somebody posted a news article. And so I do think that Facebook has great opportunity. And I think there is a possibility for that to be, to have a greater impact on news and what happens. And it may be, I have friends who use Facebook to promote their blogs and to promote their own multimedia journalism. Every week I get an invitation to Cobre Guide for Multimedia Journalism that comes to my Facebook that is sort of an update on sort of great multimedia journalism that happens. So it's already there. So I definitely think Facebook can be a platform for news aggregation, definitely. So, any final questions? I was pointing to you.
What?
I was pointing to you.
Oh, thanks. No, I didn't know where the mic was. You mentioned at the beginning, talking about some of the problems that television news is having with people, like Chris Matthews, or this entertainment where it's kind of opinion instead of news. I know that reminded me of it. And you don't get this very much with newspapers, but a lot of people who watch TV, there are a lot of people who don't know the difference between Chris Matthews and Rachel Maddow, or Keith Olbermann and Anderson Cooper, the journalists and the opinion people. Do you see this translating into a problem with blogs as well? People who may not see the difference between something like the Huffington Post and something, and I can't think of an example besides, I hate to use Perez Hilton because it's entertainment, but the idea is that he's taking news and infusing it with commentary and things like that. And you see that being a problem with blogs too, is that it comes to be more to the forefront.
I think that one of the problems that happens on the internet is context. We don't have a very good way of explaining context. When you read a newspaper, you know what the opinion page is. You know the editorial page looks a certain way, and you've sort of been trained to do that. I don't think that we have trained people yet in terms of media literacy online to say, this is opinion and this is fact. And I'm not sure, again, I think it's one of those things that the genie got out of the bottle. And we don't have a good way of sort of, when you're writing opinion, you don't actually have to put in the headline of your blog that says, well, this is opinion. It's easy to see the difference between Perez Hilton and the Huffington Post. But obviously the Huffington Post has an editorial stance. They choose to aggregate the stories that they choose. They're not Google News. They're not aggregating from an algorithm. They're aggregating from a specific ideological stance. If you read the Daily Cause, it's a different ideological stand. If you read the Daily Beast, or if you read the Drudge Report, they all come from a different position. But I agree that I don't think a lot of people, as a very broad overgeneralization, understand, what is news and what is comment. And I'll end. I'll take questions after this. But one of the reasons that I started the multimedia journalism class is that I had a student who's a very good student. And she quoted from The Onion. Everybody knows what The Onion is? She quoted from The Onion in an essay as if it was a newspaper. She's not stupid. She's a good student. And she didn't know. And I said, The Onion is satire. It's like quoting from Jon Stewart, And she's like, no, but it looks just like a newspaper. And I'm like, okay, well, and that was what gave me the impetus to say, how do we talk about this? Where do we start talking about creating context? And like on the Huffington Post, you kind of know that the blogs are over here and the news is over here, but that's not true on a lot of websites. So, last one.
Michigan Messenger, if you go there, it clearly labels opinion and reporting.
Yeah. So Michigan Messenger is funded by the Center for Independent Media, right? And they, unfortunately, are having some economic issues, but hopefully they'll come back. So it tells you what's news. Voices, when you see Voices, that is an opinion column. But I'm not, I might even change that to say opinion, so that people really know very specifically. Voices could be treated as something different.
What do you think of this as a model?
Center for Independent Media?
No, saying.
I think tagging things, definitely. And I think that's where kite marks come in. Kite marks are a way of tagging. It's a meta-tagging device so that you're actually, readers are saying, this is accurate information, this is truthful. And so when you do a search, if you did a Google search, those kite marks would begin to show up. And so you'd not only get that something had a lot of page links to it, but also that it was truthful and factual. So, last one, did you have
I wasn't going to ask this, but your Onion example and the Slumdog example kind of provoked this, is the distinction between what we're calling news and entertainment journalism is rather blurry, right? I mean, these sorts of, the Onion can lead to very important discussions and so on. And why are we assuming that journalism and literate reading publics are a central aspect of democratic participation?
Why do we assume that? Because people say so. No. Because we teach people that? No. I think, for me, it comes from sort of a background of believing that the free flow of information and sometimes the cacophony of voices is what does lead to an open, vibrant democracy. That if we don't have that, that we lose. And I look at places like Singapore and places like China, and I don't see a free flow of information. And so I question how those governments operate and how they exist. But it's a valid question, because from a Chinese perspective, they would say, well, but what we're really all about is stability and security in this country, and that a free press under a Western ideal, that's not what we want.
But it doesn't have to be journalism narrowly defined as news journalism.
I don't think it has to be narrowly defined, because I think sometimes entertainment, if you look at Jon Stewart, The Daily Show, you can consider that to be entertainment, but it drives you toward a story. Today, Charlie LeDuff, who works for the Detroit News, came to speak to one of my classes, and he is definitely a character, I would say, if my students are here. But, he showed this piece that he did with Councilwoman Conyers, and you just look at it and you think, I can't believe she did that. But I think it actually made students in the class go, who is this woman? And so now they're going to actually start looking and asking questions. So it can be sort of, if you will, the gateway drug into good journalism. So it's the marijuana of journalism. That was a really bad analogy.
Well, I think on the marijuana note,
Yeah, we should probably stop now, Susan.
please join me in thanking Fara for terrific.